Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stacy Feldman. I am the founder and publisher of Boulder Reporting Lab, which is a nonprofit local news organization here in Boulder, Colorado, part of a loose movement of entrepreneurial startups seeking to address our crisis in local news. I was previously the co-founder and editor of Inside Climate News, a national Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit news organization. Today is April 11th, 2024. It is 1:45 p.m. This is panel number 17993. It is titled, "The Changing Landscape of How We Consume News." Description: the downfall of old news forms, a dissipation of newspapers, magazines, and television, and how the next decade will reshape the way we consume news. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous people and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here is how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each of our distinguished panelists here today. For more information, you can find their full bios on the CWA website, and I'll start to my right. Marcus Brauchli is co-founder of North Base Media, which invests in and advises media and technology startups. Its portfolio includes digital media in Indonesia and in India, the UAE, and Mexico. Before co-founding MBM, Marcus was the Washington Post executive editor and a vice president of the Washington Post Company. During his tenure in the newsroom, the Post won 7 Pulitzer Prizes and revamped its digital strategy. He came to the Post from the Wall Street Journal, where he spent 24 years as a correspondent and editor. Marcus grew up here in Boulder and went to Boulder High. Next to him is William Billy Carney. Billy is the chairman and co-founder of Roca News, a digital media company that is transforming the way young people consume news. After launching in August 2020, it now has 5 million followers and subscribers across its social media, app, and newsletter. Roca is one of the fastest growing news companies in the world and has raised $6 million in venture funding. Before founding Roca News, Carney was an investment banker at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, in New York City. Next to Billy is Carl Quintanilla, who is co-anchor of CNBC Squawk on the Street and Money Movers. Since joining NBC Universal in 1999, Carl has covered a wide range of stories for CNBC and NBC News, where he was a New York and Chicago-based correspondent for Today and NBC Nightly News. His assignments have included presidential elections and international military conflicts from Israel to Iraq. Before joining NBC, Carl spent 6 years as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and he earned a bachelor's degree in political science from CU Boulder. And lastly, but not least, John Spencer. John is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security and military analyst, an internationally recognized expert and advisor on urban warfare, military strategy, tactics, and other topics, and he tells me he's been very busy lately. He served as an advisor to the top 4-star general and other senior leaders in the U.S. Army. He's the author of 3 books, is the chair of urban warfare studies at West Point, and he is the host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. Alrighty, so now we will move to opening statements. Everyone on the panel will have roughly up to 4 minutes each, and we will start with Marcus.
Thank you. It just occurred to me you're talking about local news, and we have an urban warfare expert here, and it's been kind of rough out there in the local news business. A lot of casualties. I know you have the numbers, Leslie, Stacy, but the number of people who've lost their jobs in local news, the number of news outlets that have closed in the last 20 years has been staggering, and it really has a dramatic impact on our society. I think that people don't have reliable local news in their communities. That said, I want to just maybe set a little context around local news, because I think it's probably the one area of journalism that remains in pretty severe crisis. I think if you look at national news, if you think about political news, God knows we have enough of that. National, international, economic and business, entertainment news, most of those fields, there's plenty of content available for interested consumers in the US. Local news is the one problem area in this country right now, because local news, and again, if you have the numbers, I would love to have them, because I don't have them at hand, but.
Yeah, do you want me to
please.
That? The US has lost nearly 2,900 newspapers since 2005. About 6,000 newspapers remain today. The vast majority of those are weeklies. The average age of a newspaper reader today is over 60. Last year, an average of 2.5 newspapers were shutting down every single week. The country has lost almost 2/3 of its newspaper journalists over the last couple decades. 43,000 jobs gone.
So that's roughly 1/3 of the newspapers in the US were eliminated in the last couple of decades because of economic pressures. It's important to understand why that happened. One of the reasons that newspapers have disappeared is that it used to be, if you owned a newspaper and you printed it locally, you had kind of a monopoly position in your market. There wasn't really room in most places for 2 newspapers. And a newspaper, because of its physical product, because it's a physical product and has physical distribution, there was a limit to how far it would go. And people in communities, like I grew up in Boulder, you could read your local newspaper, and that was basically what you had available to you. In Boulder, you could read the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News and the Wall Street Journal as well. But you could read your way through every printed product available to you in the space of an hour, and that was all you had. There was nothing else, and the local paper didn't really have competition in most markets, because they controlled the information the only information people had access to. Literally, that was all there was to read that was fresh every day was your local paper. As the internet sort of came into its own, actually it was first cable TV, but as digital technology sort of rose, what happened was people suddenly had access to any information from anywhere. and the barriers, the geographic barriers, the physical production barriers of local newspapers faded. And all of a sudden, people in communities all over the country, instead of just reading local news, could read national, international news. And instead of having nothing fresh to read every day except what was coming in their local paper, suddenly they could play Grand Theft Auto, or they could, watch any number of movies on their phone and do any number of other activities, and it became very hard for the local newspapers to compete. At the same time, Craigslist came along and stole the classified advertising business, and it was a much better way of advertising and selling your local goods in a community, because people could search and find things and didn't have to wait for the newspaper to come out. So there were a lot of reasons economically why local newspapers have gotten in trouble and have gone out of business, but the net result is fewer and fewer people are able to follow or are following local news. And I guess one more point I'll make on the local news front, which is when I went to become editor of the Washington Post, I'd been at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. I worked with Carl there. I came to the Washington Post. It was the first time I worked since I grew up in Boulder, for a local paper. And people think of the Washington Post today as a national paper because of its political coverage, but in fact it has a very strong local base. It had one of the highest penetrations of its communities of any big newspaper in the country. And we did an inventory of the content and who was reading the content in the Washington Post when I came down there, because we wanted to understand, we were already facing a lot of economic pressures. Our classified business had already been undermined, and we were trying to figure out, where do we need to spend money? What do people care most about? And we looked at, across all the coverage that we did, what kind of engagement it produced. And we found that people didn't read most people did not read much local coverage. They read the local coverage that was very specifically tailored to them. So we had 5 school board reporters at that point covering different school boards in the Washington area. What we found is people would only read the coverage of the school board, of the school district that their kids were in school while their kids were in school. Otherwise, the people who were reading schools coverage were probably teachers or administrators of schools or maybe local officials. But it had very low traction with audiences. Again, if you go back to the days when that was the only thing to read in town, people really read the paper cover to cover, and they read everything. So what I take away from that is we do have a civil society problem, because people are no longer reading about a wide range of local news because they get distracted by other things and they're more interested in other things. Whereas before, because it was the only thing they had to read, people were generally well informed on the same topics. And I think it led to a better civil society. So,
yeah, it's super interesting to hear the perspective on the local level. It's not something I've spent too much time thinking about, but I think, going to that point you made at the end about the kind of the divide we see in the country today, I think you also see that in the kind of consistent business models that you see generally across the larger companies, and that they're either chasing advertising dollars or subscription dollars. On the advertising side, you're pretty much incentivized to write the most incendiary headline you can so people click on your page and view your banner ad. On the other side, with subscriptions, when you're catering to one specific audience and want them to love what you do so much that they subscribe and continue to subscribe and support you, I think you end up pandering to that community a bit. So it seems like at that level, it really is a business model problem. And I think companies are going to have to get creative, and it's very tough to get creative, but I don't really see another way for media companies, especially news companies, to keep surviving in the future. I guess the other thing I'll say in my opening remarks is that an interesting thing in terms of old news versus new news is that there seems to be a changing of the medium in which information is delivered that hasn't really, it seems to not have caught on at some of the legacy institutions yet. And people for a long time have had affinities for personalities and networks. And if you watch Fox, you probably like Tucker Carlson. If you watch CNN, you like Don Lemon. If you watch CNBC, you like Carl. So I don't think that's changing. But kids nowadays are on TikTok, they're on YouTube, they're on Twitch, which is a platform where you see people either speak or play video games. And it's a very casual back and forth conversation that people have with their viewers. And I don't think there's a switch that's going to go on in people's heads when they turn 20 years old and say, oh, wow, I suddenly want to turn on the TV and watch a guy in a suit. So I think, to me, that's kind of the biggest divide between old news and new news today. Fundamentally, it feels the same. I mean, maybe journalism's a little bit different because, it used to be that there's information that only a few people are privy to, right? Something happens, you reach out to the Times, or they reach out to you and they get your perspective. Now something happens, 7 seconds later, it's on Twitter or X, and 20 different journalists are reaching out to this person to figure out what's going on. And I think also when that happens, you kind of are incentivized to put your own spin on the story, which causes a lot of problems that we have today with the media. So, yeah, that's it for me.
That's really interesting. I don't have any of the business model acumen that Billy or Marcus have. I went to Boulder. I graduated in class of '93, and while I was here, all I wanted to do was be a reporter in newspapers. And I worked for the Daily Camera. I worked for the Denver Post. I worked for Westward. I just loved being in newspapers. And I think two things I would say. One is that in the old days, there was a path where you would start out as a reporter in local news, and you would cover schools, or cover cops, or cover City Hall. And you would work your way through a series of beats over time, and you would establish enough intelligence about those beats so that at one point in your career, you would graduate to a bigger metro paper, maybe a national paper, maybe the Washington Post, maybe the Journal or the Times. And your value would come from the fact that you had covered all those beats. Now that sort of platform has been disintegrated, and so like the path for a reporter today is more like, I'm going to pick one narrow lane, I'm going to become an expert in that one thing, and that will be my strength. And I'll have podcasts and newsletters and live events, all the new revenue-generating ideas that media companies have right now, and it'll be built around me. Axios does this with some of their. Sarah Fisher is a dynamo of a media reporter, and she'll have a newsletter soon, I think, that announced this week, where it's about Sarah. So it's become hyper-personalized in that respect, where the audiences are tuning in not for the brand of the organization, but the brand of the reporter themselves. The other thing is the lack of local coverage in general is having all these weird effects. Like I saw the other day, I don't know if it was Gallup or University of Michigan, but one of the polls, they ask you, do you think the country's on the right track or on track? And of course, overwhelmingly, there's a sense that the country's on the wrong track. But when asked about their local communities or their city or state, they felt pretty good because the news has become hyper-nationalized. Everything is about the national self, and we don't have an opportunity to put into context what's local and what's national anymore. It's automatic, whether it's cable or the internet, everything became about the aggregate in this country, which is having a bunch of weird societal ramifications, which I'm sure we'll get into.
John?
I think I'm a little different than other, which they said it's fine here just to take the topic and run with it in your own little lane. Where I came, I think, from an old to new. As an academic, I pursued placing an article in every newspaper in the United States because as an academic, that's just a goal I set. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, but I do research, so I went back to doing my academics, and then when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, all of a sudden I had to learn the news broadcast interviews process, like that whole industry, the whole world. And we had a great panel talking about the business model, is there such thing as the truth, the pursuit of facts, who do you trust, where do you get your information, which I think I've had to change even the way I do that, even though I did over 500 interviews, less than 2 years, everything from CNN, Fox to TMZ. It's been a very interesting journey to include what they ask you, how their producer teams reach out to you to get to you experts to try to inform their audiences on what's going on. But in the world I now live in is all about content producers. Like everybody wants to become a content producer. But I'm a war guy, right? So I stay focused on the news that I'm looking for is war, conflict, instability, things like that. And where I go to get my information, and the fact that there have been anecdotals of like using X spaces, which is a thing that I do probably addictively, X spaces to get information before the news does. So I knew about the atrocities of Bucha before it hit news, from people on the ground discovering it. October 7th was aired actually by private video sent to the news before Israelis being involved in it was actually knew what was going on. This connectivity, I think, is changing, and people are adapting, and lots of new models and new content producers and new sources are popping up. But it's really interesting to be in this time that's not just the old versus the new, whether you like to do crossword puzzles or you want to watch TikTok. I think there's a fundamental change on how, with this ubiquitous access to anywhere in the world at any time, what do you trust? And now you have AI-generated information, that it is an interesting time to be a consumer of news. And we talked yesterday about, you know, don't have one source, but the world I work in is I'll talk to anybody. It doesn't matter what the bias. I think that all news is subjective, not objective, just based on nature of audiences and business models that people like the panel have really done an amazing job in showing me, and I knew some of it. Even when I get a question from somebody who wants to talk to me, but they want the answer to the question before they talk to me, and that could change whether they want to talk to me. Or the fact that I was doing 20 interviews a day on Ukraine, literally 20 interviews a day, newspaper, live TV, radio, AP, Reuters, because of the position I had on Ukraine and the fact that I was going in and out of Ukraine and had a position. But when it came to the war, in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, I went from doing 1 or 2 a day to doing 0, because I didn't match the position that the audiences that they felt were following. And I do one sporadically, but it has been an interesting learning curve for me of what just the processes and the techniques of old versus new.
Thank you. I want to follow up here on the business model problem that several of you mention. In my work, I've begun to view the local news crisis as a tragedy of the commons in many ways. Everybody wants it, and no one really wants to pay for it. As Marcus described, our local newspapers were supported by classified ads. The Daily Camera, every single business in town was advertising in the paper. In the 1980s, at least I've been told anecdotally, there were 70 people working in the newsroom of the Camera alone, at a time when Boulder County had 70% fewer people living in it. 70. It's almost an unfathomable number today, because today in Boulder County, there's probably less than 7 full-time journalists covering a place that now has 320,000 people. And it really does, in many ways, come down to the business model problem. I'll start with you, Marcus. What are the most viable business models for local news, or even beyond the local level, that can reduce or really end? I think we need to end our dependence on advertising revenue, because it really doesn't make sense for a local business to advertise anymore in a local paper when they can advertise on Facebook that has created a geo-targeted algorithm that is much cheaper and in many ways much more effective at getting clicks and conversions. Philanthropy is emerging, but it's insufficient. Who or what could step in to finance local journalism? What's your take also on government support? And we actually have a question from the audience on this. Why not embrace public financing of journalism like we see in Europe and elsewhere?
So I think the answer is it's one of these all the above things. I don't think there's going to be a single business model. It used to be a single business model in the U.S. You know, the model, and if I could just step back, even before I talk about that, the U.S. has had different models of journalism since its founding, and the business model of journalism is always determined by the underlying technology, because the technology basically tells you what you can do, and what you can do determines how you can make money. So if you could print newspapers one sheet at a time, the way they printed newspapers at the beginning of the 19th century, you had a very limited audience, and you were certainly selling advertising because it was the only advertising vehicle available, and you were probably targeting a specific audience. There's a line in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, when William Seward goes from Auburn, New York, population 30,000, to Washington, D.C. to work for Lincoln, 11 daily newspapers wish him well in a town of 30,000. Because they were all being printed like this, and they were each serving a specific community, like, you know, the Germans, the Lutherans, whatever. They were serving a specific community. When printing presses got faster, and you could actually produce lots of newspapers, they went to a different model. The William Randolph Hearst, we talked about this at another panel yesterday, you know, the yellow journalism, sensational journalism, that was all about selling as many newspapers as you could, because they were charging 1 or 2 cents per newspaper. And when you'd see these, you see on the videos the kids selling extra, because the presses were running 24 hours a day, and they were just trying to sell as many newspapers as possible. By the middle of the 20th century, the model for journalism, and the one that most of us knew growing up, I think everybody in this room really, it was kind of a monopoly, oligopoly model for journalism. And the idea was it was an advertising-powered business. You could print all the newspapers a community might need. You could get one of the 3 licenses for television or radio in your community. And it was, you know, you made a lot of money just having a large audience. And the goal was to have as wide a field of content as you could have to keep as many people reading as possible. And then you'd sell advertising to the large number of people. And it was, if you were the local, as you say, all the local businesses in Boulder, they'd advertise in the Daily Camera because that's the paper everybody read. You know, long before Mark Zuckerberg discovered social media and the network effect, every local newspaper in America discovered it long before Mark was born. If you have the local paper, you have birthdays, you have wedding announcements, you have deaths, everybody reads your newspaper. It's a monopoly. It's a great business. And then technology changed again, first with cable TV. And cable TV sort of fragmented the broadcast audience. It used to be there were 3 broadcast networks, and now there's, I don't know, Carl probably knows, a bazillion different channels, very specific, you know, home and garden. You can watch whatever you want. And the fragmentation continued online, digitally, and now you can, like, you name your topic, there's a vertical for you. So take it all the way back to local news. How is this going to play out in local communities? You know, one vertical, if you will, is the Boulder Reporting Lab. For people who are serious about what's going on in their community, and everybody in this room should subscribe to it and give her money because it's important, because it is important in a community to have information. But one thing that's very profoundly different, I was trying to get at in my earlier comments, is not everybody is going to be reading the news. It's just, the reality is, we're not going to get communities back to reading all the same news and voting on the basis of what they read in the local paper. Many people are just not going to read local news. You know, all news is not local anymore. It's national. People read about politics. They get excited about Fox News and CNBC and no, that's not comparing the two. MSNBC, like they watch what they care about, and they may not care about what's happening locally the way they used to. So the models that are going to emerge are going to be definitely supported by your donations. I think they should be supported by some kind of government agency or some kind. There should be some mechanism by which people should be able to maybe tick a box on your tax return and contribute $1 to having, you know, good news coverage in America. I think there will be advertising-supported products. There will be verticals in communities that are very specific. There's a great company, a group, it's not company, out of Philadelphia, Chalkbeat, who cover schools news. And Chalkbeat is starting to put local schools coverage in different communities because they know for the people who care about schools coverage, it's really important. Not everybody does, as I said before, but those people who do and make decisions about schools, they need to have high-quality content. So I think it's going to be a mashup of all these things. I don't think there's going to be one answer, and I think that there are going to be different answers in different communities depending on the ability of a community to support something through advertising or subscription.
Anyone else want to weigh in on business model problem, funding models, government support? No.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. In terms of finding an ideal business model, I think it certainly is all of the above and maybe even a little more. And media companies are making money in ways that they weren't before. I'll use us as one example, and then I'll speak about another. So we started our company, and we were on Instagram, we were on a newsletter, and both pretty, you know, traditional, whatever, you can stick an advertisement in their models. We also developed an app, and the idea behind the app is that it gamifies news. If you've ever used Duolingo or heard of Duolingo, it's this language learning app where you kind of play games and level up as you learn a language. There's more people learning a language on Duolingo now than there are high school students in the US learning languages. And So what does it mean to gamify the news? So in one thing on our platform, you see a photo of a story taking place around the world. You have to guess where the story takes place on a globe. You click and then you fly, then you read the story there. And it's been our most successful, most lucrative monetization strategy yet, is that people will pay to deepen the game experience. It's very difficult to get them to pay for news straight up, but when you offer them something kind of on top of the news or that works together with the news, they are willing to pay to deepen that experience. Another one I wanted to speak about was, going back to the personality point, there is a podcast called Nelk. It was these guys, they used to do pranks on YouTube and they kind of blew up. And now they have a podcast, and the podcast has done very well, and it's guys, late 20s, early 30s, just, kind of shooting the crap with each other. And what they did was they started making a spiked seltzer, which is, a pretty crowded market. And they just take the can, and they stick it on the table, and they talk. They don't even mention it. But people love them. They love the brand. They watch the show. The seltzer is called Happy Dad, and I think it does over $50 million in sales now. So it's remarkable. I mean, it's creative and it's new, and that's not going to work for anybody. Stuff like that you need massive scale for. I don't know if it's viable at the local level, but it is cool to kind of see the newer ideas that are coming into play.
I think one thing I find that's interesting is we do a lot of live events at CNBC. That's a huge push for us to make up for the money that's being lost in legacy models. And I think it's because I think it's not that consumers got less curious. I think consumers still want to know what's going on, but there became a real suspicion about the editorial process. Why did they choose to do that story? Why did they put it on page one? Why did they choose the people that they talked to for this story? And so the it is the curating, fact-checking process that kind of came under fire. And as a response, the live event allows you just to see the raw discussion. It's a reporter and a subject on a stage, and they dish it out. You hear it's basically the raw transcript of their interview live for 45 minutes, let's say, and then afterwards you get to approach. There's networking effects among participants, and you pay a fee for that. It's turned out to be, I think, powerful for us, and we do it in various levels through like sector. We'll have a healthcare vertical that has its own live event, and maybe one about technology. But I think part of it stemmed from the suspicion that grew about how do you guys do what you do, and why, because it is a little bit mysterious, the process of ferreting out information, and more importantly, verifying information, which people felt that they really didn't understand.
Let me go to a student question, because it's a good follow, I think, from that in some ways. Young people in the United States struggle to take polarizing media seriously. Will we see a trend, or are we already seeing a trend, I think John's going to say no, towards less divisive news, or will we always be plagued by such? This is a huge conversation in journalism right now.
I'm only laughing because we had a discussion prior to the panel about being on Turkish television news, right? Where it is divisive.
Yeah, it is. And I think the answer to that question probably lies in the business model, not to go back to it, but if you're incentivized to kind of cater to an audience and run things that they want to see over and over again, you're probably going to sway that way. I do think, especially with the younger generation, that there is a kind of a growing affinity for products that are not so crazy and divisive. So when we go out to advertise our business, the best advertisement we've ever run is we just put up this slide, and it says, and we do this on Instagram, it says, 3 years ago, a few friends thought that the news was too polarizing, so they made a nonpartisan news option. You can check it out here. And everybody instantly follows. So it's kind of concerning that you can just say, look how much everyone sucks, come to us, and it works. But that's what we found.
So for me, it's interesting to see what the threats are to the old ways of doing it. Whether it's a belief that people have a less attention span, but Joe Rogan has the biggest podcast in the world in its long form, or that you have content producers coming up on X who have more followings than most mass media single broadcasts of a single episode. And they're definitely not trusted sources, and actually people are gravitating to them because they're the anti-establishment voices. And there are some very vile ones that I have actually interacted with, or ones who are experts in different fields but now because of that, have this massive voice and everybody's turning to them for their news or analysis. Whether it's like you were talking about on whether it's a TikTok channel, a YouTuber, or whatever, I think people were initially going, okay, yeah, but we still have like you said, that you had to figure out a way to give visibility, provide variety in programming so people can self-select, but just in the threats of X, TikTok, and everybody encroaching into that, I don't see how the old way survives.
I guess I'm once again in the all of the above category. I think that actually there is room for different forms of media. There's a lot of confusion about what is journalism, and people talk about, Joe Rogan, or they talk about, I've used this, forgive me if anybody was in an earlier panel, but the spectrum of content is so wide now, and people think that, some people thought that InfoWars and Alex Jones was news, because it kind of it masquerades as news, and it shows up in your inbox like news. And if for whatever reason you think that's real, and it fits with your worldview, you might actually think it's news. And it just because, CNN has something different but looks the same, you might choose to not believe CNN. And the problem we have today is there's a lot of stuff masquerading as news, a lot of aggregation as opposed to actual journalism, a lot of commentary as opposed to actual journalism. And journalism, I think there continues to be incredible demand for journalism, in part because journalism is sort of the underlying bedrock on which all these edifices are built. You don't get aggregation, you don't get commentary unless you have basic information. There is a lot of interest still in this country in long-form journalism. In fact, there's been some research that the phrase investigative journalist connotes to people, well, that journalism is good because they've actually gone and done investigative work. Like all journalism as journalism is to some degree investigative. You're actually trying to find out, real information. Journalism is like it is axiomatic that journalism. People ask, well, who fact checks journalism? Like, well, that's what journalism is. Journalism is fact checking. So when people say, well, who's fact checking that journalism? Like, the journalist who's doing journalism is fact checking. That's what it's. People are very confused right now about what is journalism. And it's intentional. A lot of people, they want to undermine the credibility of institutions, not just journalism, but we've seen in our society largely, there's been a lot of delegitimization of institutions because it serves various political interests. But I take a lot of heart from the fact that people do read long-form journalism. CNBC, to flatter my colleague up here, is first-rate, high-quality journalism and information all day, every day. Those people know what they're talking about, they live in the world of facts, and they have a very die-hard core audience of people who not only watch it every day, but place billions or trillions of dollars of bets on the information that they get from these guys. It exists in local communities. There's people like Stacy doing high-quality journalism in every community. And I guess I have a maybe naive hope and expectation that at some point, people are going to get tired of the noise for the reasons that Billy says. Like, I'm just tired of this partisan yelling and screaming. And it may get a lot of attention, it may be very noisy, but it's not what people, I think, ultimately want in their lives. And I guess I hope that people will migrate back to high-quality information.
I would add, just to Marcus's point about fact-checking, some of the most traumatic nights I've had as a journalist have been dealing with the copy desk, say at the Journal, where it's 4:45 and the first run of the paper is going to begin in 15 minutes, and this person in New York I worked in the Chicago bureau, and this person in New York is like, when you say this, where are you getting that? And as a reporter, especially a cub reporter, which I was at the time, that's terrifying. But it's, what's the word? It's edifying and instructive over time to where eventually you don't run into so many of those hard conversations. But that was hard work. answering the copy desk or a news desk on a story that you really thought you understood, and it was a huge gut check to go back and think, well, do I have that right? I guess I should go back to my notes or look at the transcript of my interview. That's what that process is about.
It's not enough to produce high quality journalism. We have to get it in front of people, and a few of you have mentioned the distribution problem, the fragmentation between and among demographics. I think this has really become a huge topic of conversation recently because we have seen profound changes in our social media landscape. News organizations become really dependent on distributing their news through social media. Facebook recently altered its algorithm again to really suppress news for complicated reasons. If you're a news organization dependent on reaching your audience through Facebook, you're going to suffer profound audience and monetary losses. We've all seen what happened to Twitter. You change a CEO and the platform becomes something else. How do we reach audiences in 2024, 2030, 2035? Billy, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Based on what I understand about your company, you have a reliance on Instagram for disseminating your news. How do you plan for algorithm changes, platforms like Meta? Where are people going to get their news years from now?
It's a great question. And yeah, Meta has been crushing news. So they recently came out and made a default setting where if you are putting out political content, it will not be shown to non-followers. So what that means is if I'm a typical Instagram page and I go out and I post like a picture of my dog, there's a chance if enough people like it, the algorithm picks it up and it shows it to people, and that's how your page grows. They said if our systems detect you're doing political content, it's not going up there. So the method for growth is pretty much cut off. Also, very recently, they said that even from pages you follow, they will suppress content that is fact-checked to be incorrect. And if it's wrong, that's fine, that's one thing, but who's doing the fact-checking? Like, it's a total black box, and it's frustrating. With that said, we kind of came up, we started in 2020, and that was almost right at the height of when this was going on. I think the first times, at least that we saw it, was when there was pressure from the government on Meta to suppress COVID misinformation. And so what they did was anytime COVID was mentioned to avoid, the tyranny of the government or whatnot, they just totally shut off the post. So you could say on Instagram, COVID vaccines are good, go get a shot. Because the word COVID's in it, because the word vaccine's in it, they're going to suppress the post and it's not going to get out there. So you couldn't say anything. Coming up in that age, we've kind of learned to deal with it. And we censor funny words and people are like, why would you censor the word vaccine? And we just kind of know you have to do it. At least for us, we kind of are learning how to play the game, or we have learned how to play the game. In terms of what we're going to do in the future, again, great question. I'm not so sure, but I think as long as there's a will, people will keep trying.
I mean, I have I have an addiction to X spaces, and to X in general. I used to live in Italy and went once to Venice to a place which was the old way news was distributed. You got up on the stone, you stood out, you called out the message. But the crowd could also ask questions or boo or whatever back. And I interestingly got in an exchange recently with David Sachs, Elon Musk. I've been on panels with them on that platform because that access is unique when a consumer gets access to a content producer, not in a scripted way. I don't know what that future looks like in its impact on news, but it feels like there's something there.
It is. They are awesome platforms, for one, getting out there. I mean, our company could never have existed without social media. And it is such a unique opportunity to directly see what people say after you say something and get their feedback. They are such awesome, powerful platforms, assuming, everything's run well and smoothly and fairly. But yeah, I just figured I'd throw that on.
And do you see Instagram as the primary platform that younger people are consuming news through?
Not necessarily. It was for us because when we started the company, we were all on Instagram and we kind of understood the platform. I think it could even be the least viable because it's, I mean, they do more videos now, but for the most part, it is static posts. So when we actually started the company, the idea was to take a newsletter and just put it on Instagram in like an accessible format, and that was kind of our unique spin. We just like put photos up that would represent, the day's news. I think going back also to the personality thing, I think TikTok, platforms like Twitch, where you are seeing someone's face and having that, personal connection are probably more viable over time. But, even on X too, where things are generally short, but you also have the spaces, you got to kind of learn to play in the lane that you're in.
One thing I'll say is, so I now run a company that invests in and helps build digital media companies around the world. And we learned the lesson the hard way not to be dependent on the platforms. That we won't invest in a company today if it's dependent on a platform controlled by Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. Like, they're erratic, unreliable, and naturally selfish for their company's interests. We had a company in India that was a great company that delivered news over WhatsApp. And you could, those of you who know WhatsApp, it's a messaging platform that's now owned by Meta, the proprietors of Facebook. And WhatsApp limited the number of people you could have in any one group to 250 or 256 or something. But these guys had figured out that while you could only put 250 people into your group, 250 million people could include you in their groups. And so they built a news platform where if you added certain phone numbers into your group, then you could start just entering very simple code. You just type plus info, and it would give you a whole range of different kinds of content you could subscribe to. You could subscribe to news about Trump. You could subscribe to news about Formula One. You could actually get Formula One results as they went around the track. You could do currency conversions and language translations, train schedules, all on this platform. And the Indian government started using it to deliver health news because a lot of people in India, the only platform they had was WhatsApp. They couldn't afford a data plan on their phone. So it was a great product. It reached 25 million people, and it migrated from India to Africa, because a lot of Indian diaspora in Africa, and it became the #1 news app in Zimbabwe at the time Mugabe was overthrown in Zimbabwe. At which point, it drew the attention of Facebook, including Mark Zuckerberg, who said, well, we don't want other people using our platform to organize these groups because we want to actually start selling advertising to these groups. And they would not tell us, we needed to raise money for the company because it was growing very fast. And we wanted them to tell our funders, other funders, that we are not going to interfere with this because it is a social good that people are getting high quality news in places they wouldn't otherwise get news. And their response was, we cannot give you that guarantee because Mark is interested in this area and it is likely at some point we're going to block companies like yours from reaching these audiences. So our company died. And, totally their prerogative. It's their platform. But it tells you about the risks of going with any of these platforms. We should, media companies have to find ways of connecting directly to audiences, which is why the subscriber model is actually good because, newsletters and subscriptions and things like that, you get one-to-one connection. And you can ultimately, it's not going to be the scale of before, but with any luck, you can actually operate successfully.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why a lot of new news organizations like mine have really doubled down on email and newsletters is that if, for instance, MailChimp were to be taken over by another owner like Elon Musk, we could take those emails with us. We own the emails. We own the audience we built. The audience we built on Facebook or Twitter is not ours. We cannot take that anywhere else. It only works on that platform, but not everyone consumes news in email either. So it raises other problems. So I'd be remiss not to address the topic of AI. Even in my small newsroom, we've been leveraging generative AI for certain tasks, analyzing data sets, summarizing derivative press releases, debugging code, and that's, a tiny, that doesn't even represent its world-changing abilities, of course. How do you foresee AI transforming the news industry across media? And what opportunities might it present? I think we often focus on the disruptive aspects of these groundbreaking technologies in negative ways, how they're going to ruin the world, but is there anything to be optimistic about?
Yeah.
Wow.
Looking to the young person.
I was looking at you. So, yeah, as mentioned, AI can be, I think, a really powerful tool to help assist in the content creation. We use it ourselves, for things like double-checking facts and addressing grammar concerns. In terms of the actual delivery of news, and thankfully, because I don't think anybody wants it to go this way, people don't seem very eager to have an AI deliver them the actual news and write it for them. There was the snafu at ESPN a few months ago. There's also this company called Artifact. It was started by Kevin Systrom, the founder of Instagram, about a year ago. And Artifact was a news feed app where they marketed it, this is AI news, this is the future, would organize which articles you would see and make a personal feed curated just for you based off of the preferences that this AI would understand. 9 months later, it went under. And they had a lot of money behind them. They had Kevin Systrom behind them, a guru. So I think the world, thankfully, certainly doesn't seem ready for actual AI news, but in terms of the positives, it certainly helped us, streamline the process, which, I think some people would say, oh no, you're not hiring as many people. But at least from a startup's perspective that's so tight on cash, it has helped us edit, find stories, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say it's being employed kind of as a prompt within newsrooms right now, meaning it's not going to be a consumer-facing element. But if you're a producer and you're working on a television segment and you're having a guest on, we have some people now who are playing with what should I ask the CEO of Travelers who's coming on. Give me everything you have on Travelers right now and put it in the form of some questions. That's something we're experimenting with. I mentioned live events earlier, though, and I was reading this week that Steve Carell, the actor, is doing a Broadway show, and he was being asked, why are you doing Broadway? And part of his answer was that it's live, and it's real, and that there are actual human beings in front of you doing something original, and he thought he was net bullish on Broadway long term because you can't deep fake a play. It's happening in front of you, which I think, again, feeds the element of how much of this can we get in front of a real live audience.
I agree on that point where, yeah, of course AI can enable lots of functions from collecting information, but it really gets down to trust. In news, you trust certain people, you trust certain institutions. You're still going to need human interaction to have that trust, in my opinion.
The flip side of AI is that it's very easy to create fake content that looks like news content. And one of the challenges we're going to face, I think, starting in a big way this year, is people are going to produce videos using AI that look like Carl delivering a report on CNBC. And it may be done for electoral purposes, although we tend to focus right now on civil society, politics issues. But imagine you're a consumer products company, and you make a fake video of Carl talking about, doing a report on CNBC saying that, Johnson & Johnson is recalling its best-selling product because it has some terrible flaw. It only has to be out there and get to a certain number of people for a certain period of time, and the stock will tank, and somebody out there can make money. Now, they'll probably get caught because the SEC probably figured that one out. But there's going to be huge challenges around validating and verifying content. And there's a lot of technology companies right now working on, how do you watermark content so this is real? And then how do you watermark content in a way that can persist through AI so that if it actually is real content, but an AI has picked it up, you can still know that it's real as opposed to fake. And then there's other companies, there's a great company in New York, actually, startup they do this provenance, they look at videos or they listen to audio, and in real time they'll tell you not that it's real, they'll tell you that it's likely fake. And they say they can do, with 90% accuracy, they can tell you something is fake, which sounds like not quite enough, but if you're trying to decide whether to believe something, either because you want to use it for journalism purposes or for commercial reasons, 90% saves you a lot of time and effort, because then you just have to figure out the last 10% whether it's real or not. And this guy started off thinking he was going to help media companies, and now he's got these big banks coming to him, because some of you may have investment accounts or bank accounts where you can use your voice to authorize transactions, and those products launched in the banks just at the same time synthetic audio launched, and it's kind of a disaster for the banks right now. So this guy has figured out, a technology that he can, and I think JP Morgan is one of his clients. JP Morgan can now, 90% of the fakes they can throw out. 10% they don't know, they have to spend time on, but it saves them a lot of money. So I think we're entering a really, AI is going to make life much simpler in some ways and way more complicated in others.
It might actually, I think it'll prompt consumers to rely more on second sources now than they already do. Like this morning, O.J. Simpson, right, you might have heard, is dead. And I saw it right away. I think ABC had it first, and then TMZ. But our own NBC standards desk, you never go to air with anything until standard says this is good to go for us. So, that's obits are a classic example of that. But I think consumers will be like, kind of like, well, the Post has it, but I'm going to wait to see if the Times gets it too. And think that'll be translated into an AI environment.
Which is my world, where something can happen in a war and it'll travel the world before any news desk gets it.
Yeah.
And the news is trying to reportedly this number, reportedly this, and we're seeing that danger right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We'll go to a student question. I think this is for you, Carl. What is your advice for aspiring journalists in maintaining journalistic integrity while adjusting appropriately with this new media landscape in order to have a career? How can young people have a career in journalism today?
I think honesty is key. I think we're entering an environment, it happened with cable news, evening cable news, where you know where everybody stood. You know where Sean Hannity stands, you know where Don Lemon stands, and then somewhere in them there's a spectrum of opacity where, all right, I think I know where Anderson Cooper stands, but in general, you just have to be upfront with your audience, and if, depending on your level of comfort, how much about yourself are you going to reveal, and that's all part of the blend of opinion and news that happened when business figured out just how expensive the news business is. You got to fill the rest with opinion. But if your goal is to be a news journalist and you have no interest in telling the world how you feel about anything, then surround yourself with people who have similar goals and never get anything wrong. And I think, I always say, in the old days, we used to get letters to the editor, and they were mean, right? And your editor himself was often mean. So you're used to getting pummeled with negative commentary. Social just added one more plate to the party where you're just going to get hammered. And I think just come to grips with the fact that this is a business that is not for the thin-skinned. You're going to get a lot of hate, and over time, I don't know. I mean, to say you get used to it is an interesting thought, but I do think you get used to it, and if you really want to do it, you'll keep doing it.
What do you tell young people when they ask you about entering journalism, Marcus?
Me? Well, I went to speak to a journalism class this morning, and I didn't say this, although I was ready to say it, because I was waiting for the question, like, should we study journalism? Although then it occurred to me afterward that they were all studying journalism. But my argument for journalism, for studying journalism, for students who are thinking about it, is the skills of journalism are useful in any industry today. How do you figure out what's true? We were just talking about the challenges around that, which is getting more complicated. How do you organize information and present it in a way that's comprehensible and interesting to people? how do you contextualize information? All those things are incredibly useful. I think never more useful than in the kind of chaos, information chaos that we live in today. So I think there's lots of reasons to study journalism and to understand how journalism works. I think journalism jobs are changing. You know, television journalism is very different than, actually, all there's such a spectrum. I talked earlier about this spectrum of different kinds of journalism, but there's a spectrum of like different kinds of jobs in journalism. Like, you know, if you're a commentator, if you're an aggregator, you're relying on information that other kinds of journalists are actually getting from the field, like, you know, reporting stuff that's hard to get and original. Like, there was a lot of concern that AI was going to eliminate journalism jobs. It will eliminate some jobs, process jobs, like some copy editing jobs, some graphic design jobs are going to be eliminated by AI. But, you know, AI is not going to replace the journalist who goes off with John to the front lines in Ukraine. It's not going to replace the journalist who, you know, covers the Paris fashion shows. And it's not, you know, there's a lot of original content that it actually puts a premium value on those things. So I'm not naive. I don't think that there's going to be as many journalism jobs as there were. We just said there were 40,000 fewer than there were.
Yes.
But I also think that we're entering a period of growth in journalism. There's going to be a lot of startups. There are a lot of startups, a lot of digital media companies emerging in local communities. Carl's former boss, Andy Lack, the NBC executive, is running a company that has local news sites in Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, I think, so far. And
is that the Newsline, the state's newsrooms?
No, I don't know what it's called, but. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on, and I think there's need for and there's room for a lot of journalism still.
I think, yeah, you could argue, like, I don't know, when we were kids, like my dad brought home the Journal, but I didn't read it, but I watched him read it, and I had to get older until I had an interest in reading it. My kids are now 14, like they read a lot of news. And at an age where I was not yet reading the paper. So, I mean, I think we're growing news consumers at an earlier stage in life. Whether that results in a net increase in news consumption in aggregate remains to be seen, but we're definitely getting people in the habit of consuming news younger.
Where do they consume news on?
Oh, Instagram. Instagram was almost, I'd say, by far they're number one. So they don't have TikTok.
You don't let them have TikTok?
I don't think they have any interest yet.
Really?
I think the echo around the TikTok discussion is that it's somehow suspicious, dangerous. Is the government going to ban it or force it to be sold? They hear all that stuff.
Interesting. We've had a couple of questions about radio. Where does radio fit into this discussion? What is the future of outlets like NPR? Thoughts about radio and its future?
I mean, the big news in radio right now is this piece that was written by a former NPR. I think, was he on the desk or a reporter?
He's still
he's
there.
Yeah.
He's an editor. Yeah.
Basically arguing that NPR lost its. I interned for All Things Considered my junior year in DC, and I had a great experience. I'm not a regular consumer of NPR anymore, but his argument is that they became too insular, especially post-2016, and it's caused all kinds of rumblings within the public radio community right now. I've seen other takes. Glenn Thrush of the New York Times today, or yesterday, said you can't argue with the infrastructure they built around the world to cover world news in ways that no one else really does, in this country at least. But in terms of the business model, I don't have a lot.
I think NPR is an invaluable service still. I read that article. I think there's a lot of validity to it. I mean, NPR is an insular place, and it definitely comes at the news from a certain perspective, but they have a lot of super high quality people. It does have, it has incredibly wide distribution. Their biggest challenge, actually, it's a model challenge because they have local NPR stations, and the local NPR stations both contribute content to and get content from NPR, but the local stations want to control the relationship with the audiences, not NPR nationally. So, you know, in the business media world, it's complicated to not have the connection directly to your audience and have your audience go through other people. But I think, I'm a huge radio consumer mostly because I end up driving around a lot.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to add on quickly here. Yeah, I to a point that John brought up earlier, I think people like to pretend that like the curiosity gene like skipped over Gen Z, and that's just not true. People will sit down and listen to a 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast or another one of those big podcasts purely on audio and not miss a beat. I guess in terms of the like kind of changing how people go about consuming that, though, like I don't know a single person my age who goes into a car and turns on the radio. Every single person connects their smartphone and plays either music or a podcast from there.
But are they listening to NPR podcasts?
Yeah, a pretty wide range. There was one produced by NPR, and I forget the name of it, that I did hear someone put on once. People like The Daily from
New York Times.
The Times, How I Built This with Guy Raz. It's like the startup one my friends like. So it is a wide range.
When I was at NPR, I mean, the joke was always you want to do the story that has the person, the listener, in their car, get home, pull into the driveway, and not get out because they want to hear the end of the piece. Like that's what's stylistically what you were shooting for. But then the way in which driving plummeted during COVID, and now with remote work, I mean I don't know what average mileage is in this country in terms of miles driven, but commuting times are lower because we have more freedom, and I wonder what that does to listenership.
I could be wrong here. I think there's going to be no AM radio in electric cars too, right? And so that would theoretically 20 years from now kind of crush this.
Well, NPR is not on AM though, right?
No, maybe not for NPR.
Yeah, so.
I mean, one of the things
What's on
I've
it?
just heard anecdotally from smaller public radio stations is that they are losing members. A lot of their budgets are driven by monthly recurring donations, and people have membership and subscription fatigue because not only are we subscribing to our newspapers, we're also subscribing to Netflix and HBO Max, and there's a hierarchy of importance, I guess, to those subscriptions that people decide, and especially for the smaller stations, I think they're in a period of having to really rethink their business models like everyone else. We have a couple minutes left, so if you have questions, bring them up. Somebody asked me, what is the revenue model for Boulder Reporting Lab or the Colorado Sun? I know less about the Colorado Sun, but it's probably pretty similar to ours, just at a larger scale. We have 4 main revenue streams, all in the development stage. Boulder Reporting Lab was seed funded from the Google News Initiative, which is a philanthropic arm of Google that has been supporting local news efforts now for, I think, 2 decades, and has spent about $300 million often bringing startups like ours, helping them come to life, supporting women entrepreneurs in journalism, and people of color. And I think it's very quiet about it, but it's really done tremendous work. And we wouldn't be where we are without that initial support. That grant ended last summer, and we've been trying to leverage that to build 3 other revenue streams. One is just small individual donations. This is people giving an average of about $120 a year. They know it's free to consume our news, but they believe in what they're doing, so they treat it like a subscription. That revenue stream is exceeded all of our expectations, and I think holds a lot of promise here in Boulder, in part because the community is so civically engaged. They believe in journalism, and in some ways it's polarized, but not in the same way that it's polarized at a national level. We also have a sponsorship stream, and we get grants from just local people who donate beyond, say, a $5,000 mark. It's a model. All those streams are much easier to do at scale, right? Because only a small percentage of your readers, we're aiming for 10% of our readers to donate. We're not even there yet, is ever going to donate. So if you're the Colorado Sun and your potential audience is 7 million people, 10% of 7 million is a lot of money. 10% of 100,000 in Boulder is not enough, and and we're not even there yet. So everything just gets a lot more difficult the more hyper local you go. But and I love the Colorado Sun. The Colorado Sun is not sitting in the city council meetings. They're not in the planning board meetings. They're not covering our transportation advisory board, and they're not covering our local elections. So, you know, we can't. There's no redundancy at a community level for news. I think that's our. Are we done? Okay. I'll end there. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.